Justify. Prove to be right or reasonable. Justification is at the heart of all legal and political argument. But at a time when argument itself is slave to appearances, it is time to bring back a culture of justification. Justify, a podcast on law and politics in India from the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, hosted by Arghya Sengupta.
Hello, everyone. In today's episode, we'll be discussing political violence in India, both its stormy history as well as its rather turbulent present. We'll explore the almost organic interface of violence with elections. We've just had 5 elections in 5 states in India, and several of these elections were fought on law and order issues, the promise to end violence. But how far are we getting in that quest? India's political landscape, as you all know, is no stranger to violence. One need only recall the history of Punjab and its unique relationship with insurgency, which prompted the original TADA Act, the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act. Its progeny, of course, have multiplied since then. There is also Uttar Pradesh with increasing incidents of communal and caste-based violence, with the government sometimes a participant and sometimes an enforcer. And lest I forget, West Bengal, where electoral violence is endemic, and there's been this horrific killing of 8 people in Birbhum district recently to just show where we are in 21st century India. I'm pleased and delighted to introduce my friend and professor of history at the University of Cambridge, Shruti Kapila. Shruti is the author of the pioneering work Violent Fraternity, Political Thought in the Global Age, and I'm delighted to have her today to discuss issues of political violence and also her great book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Arghya. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, with Vidhi, which has been a kind of, great context for me to learn about emerging debates in law and politics in India. So a total pleasure.
Thanks very much, Shruti. And before we dive into a discussion of the book, I thought for our audience, it would be useful if I gave a very, very short summary. In her book, Shruti analyzes modern Indian history from the first rebellion of 1857 to independence in 1947, and the many political figures in 19th and 20th century India. The book frames Indian history through the lens of ideas and the power of ideas as objects of political innovation and transformation. It's a remarkable book, and having read it as a lawyer, I think it has many insights on various issues as well as various personalities, including a very original take on the Constitution, which we will come to. Praising Violent Fraternity, Thomas Blom Hansen, the author of an equally remarkable book, The Law of Force, has prettily captured some of Shruti's arguments. Antagonism between Hindus and Muslims that culminated in partition was foundational to Indian political life. And the Indian Constitution was a direct response to this enduring crisis of violence. As Shruti argues, this was not just partition violence, as we think of it usually, it was India's civil war. So Shruti, first, on the title, the word violence and the word fraternity don't ordinarily sit well together. There's a conflation there. Because fraternity implies a kind of brotherhood, violence implies a kind of enmity. Why have you used this title?
Well, thank you. It's a paradox, and it's a deliberate paradox, because one of the claims of the book is that any politics, whether in the West, any politics, is dependent on the idea of antagonism or opposition or even enmity. And I was quite struck that in India, in contrast to Europe, so if you look at even most recently with the Jewish question in the mid-20th century, very catastrophic violence, the idea of the foreigner, or more recently, the immigrant, the refugee, the idea of the foreigner, the external, has always occupied that place of the political enemy for. And India, it's the opposite. It's the intimate brother. And, this is why the Gita is so instructive and becomes so paradigmatic for our political thinkers. It's the intimate brother, it's the kin, it's the neighbor. And I'll just give you one contrasting example since you began with the mutiny. So in the Indian mutiny of 1857, which actually takes the British 2 years to quell. And, it's the largest violence the British will see in the 19th century outside of Crimea. So it's a really violent moment. It's not something that just happens in a few kasbahs in UP. It's actually quite widespread and pretty violent. Indians kill British men, women, and children in large numbers. We've all seen Janoon, you can sort of remember from that, how much as it were the British domestic fabric got, became part of the violence. And 90 years later, the British are singularly spared. In when you have the moment of decolonization, freedom, or partition, however you want to name that time, and I was struck by that. So what happened? And the answer lies in actually India's first failed movement of mass mobilization, the Swadeshi movement of 1905-08, when Indian leaders actually realized that the British state, though small, is incredibly powerful and will now need a completely different political vocabulary to mount a challenge. So it's not
So that
simply.
leads to the question, sorry to interrupt you, but that leads to the question, so is India a fraternity at all?
Well, yes, I mean, fraternity is given. This is precisely the point. Hindus and Muslims have been fraternal, have lived for centuries together, and so of course for Ambedkar, the problem is precisely that India is non-fraternal. And for him, the non-fraternal aspect is in the caste system, because caste demands separation. And so he's saying, like, how do you make India into a democratic brotherhood? Because there is this fission, separation at the heart of the caste system. And he would actually therefore triangulate reservations as we understand it today, or the recognition of the Dalit as at the center of India's affirmative action, with the partition question, with the Hindu.
That's right. That's right. And I just want to continue with this line of thought, because when I was reading the book, it struck me that most of its chapters, whether it deals with Ambedkar, who thinks that India is not a fraternity because it's defined by caste, which is based on division, whether it's Savarkar, who obviously sees the Muslim as someone who doesn't have his Punya Bhumi in India, so doesn't really belong here into this fraternity of Hindus, as he thinks of the country, and Hindus is widely defined as including other Indic religions as well in his conceptualization. So it seems to me that India's always had this history of violence, but never really a history of fraternity. Would that be an accurate description?
Well, that's a very interesting way to put it. I would actually go the opposite. I would say that India has been a fraternity, is a given brotherhood. Look, people live cheek by jowl with a huge amount of distinction, a huge amount of all kinds of inequality. So it's a dense fabric. It's a dense social fabric, despite it, including its. So the difference, if I may be allowed to make a kind of historic comparison between Europe and India, is that actually all kind of passages into modern statecraft, like for the constitution in Britain too, they have a parliamentary representation, have gone through the trajectory of civil war. So, we all have read Hilary Mantel. I mean, all of that is actually about religious civil wars at the heart of Catholicism and Protestantism in Britain, which then wreaks violence, and out of which you produce Thomas Hobbes, who's the theorist of the modern state meaning that the state will be the rightful holder and prosecutor of violence, right? And up to till date, this is the story. Now in India, this is not to say that the Mughals were great. In India, the same, or just simply peaceful, but it is a striking parallel that India did not have religious wars in the early modern period. And in a way, civil war, it takes place in 1947 in between Hindus and Muslims at the moment of partition. And partly the question of violence, it's not just about fraternity. The question is that violence is decoupled from the state in India. This is the most significant innovation of India's anti-colonial thinkers, Gandhi in the non-violent register, Tilak in the violent register, to actually say that, violence is something that we individuals possess. It is a capacity that you and I have. It is not something that the state can abstract and take, which of course it has taken and depoliticized Indians. And this, in a way, is at the heart of the sedition debates in India. Tilak's case. And this is, I think, the fundamental division in India. There's an ideological, cyclic division in India between Hindutva and non-Hindutva, but there is also a real structural problem or status of Indian politics, that the state is, not the same as the political order. And And there
And I
is a
think you
big
make a
gap.
very interesting point there, and this is kind of a running thread in your book, which I really urge everyone to read. As in,
Oh,
for
thank you.
a book that's written by an academic historian, it's startlingly simple and easy to read, and you can go through these chapters very quickly, as I did over 2 days.
Thank
And I think there is the running thread is this decoupling
you.
of violence from the state,
Mhm.
and that move allows you to see partition
Right.
as a civil war. As in, it's not state sponsored, it kind of
Yeah.
happens
Yeah.
at that time. But I'm wondering how true that is
Mm.
today, because some might say,
Yeah.
and I'm only playing devil's advocate here, that the civil war hasn't happened. The civil war is yet to happen.
Wow.
It's going to come. And if
Wow.
it is going to come, it's going to be very European in the sense that this decoupling is not there. You can see there is, and it's not just the state, and perhaps it's the state resonating what it sees in its people. You can see that there are the beginnings of a certain kind of division, which has always remained in India. As you pointed out, the brother was always the enemy,
Mm.
and I think that has kind of translated, like it did in Mantel's England,
Mm.
translating into the state.
Well,
So
it's very
how do
interesting you
you
say
see
that.
where we
Okay,
are
so
going with civil war?
now let's come to the contemporary moment, because there are debates on how lineages into the present belong to our founding moment in politics. But let's say a couple of things about the state. All states are coercive. That we cannot get away from, right? But the thing is that most states, and this is where the story of the Indian state is slightly different from the Western one, that the modern state was external. When the appearance of the modern state came with the censuses and the like with the colonial state, it was external to Indian society. It sat on top. It was a superficial but very powerful body. Now, in post-independence, I was just having this debate with colleagues last night at dinner, as it happens, over a high table, precisely over this issue about the state and in India. And you could say that perhaps the Nehruvian generation was also quite, in a way, had a kind of sense of noble obligation to improve Indian society and bring it in line to a different kind of, where this, it had to come in line with certain, let's say, enlightened values of the state. Now, that is not the case since India's multi-party democracy in the 80s. One could arguably say that in today's India, it's moving a lot like China, where the party and the state might become indistinguishable. So it might become a party state rather than necessarily a civil war. There may be people who fantasize about large-scale violence in India or fear it. But I think that the trajectory of the Indian state is now precisely to close this gap between the political order and state power. And the mechanism for that is the BJP and the RSS. So it's more like a party state in India.
Well, I think that's a possible trajectory that we could embark on, and certainly it's certainly within the realms of possibility. But I think there's another point which I was trying to make, which is the fact that perhaps not so much civil war, but as much as the centrality of political violence and the acceptability of political violence emanating from the state among society. So let me give you an example. When Yogi Adityanath came to power in 2017, he has said, and I quote, "Agar aparadh karenge to thok diye jayenge."
Yeah.
As in, this is so for our listeners, as in, if you commit a crime, then you will be hit. Okay, thok can mean a variety of things, but let's translate it as hit. And this is something this is a popular plank, that maybe it's a failure of our justice system, but it's a very popular plank, that this is a sarkar, and that a number of persons cutting across religious lines has said is a sarkar that is strong on law and order. It doesn't brook any dissension. It does not brook any crime. Crime rates in UP are down, and this is factual. They are down. Right? So it seems to me that there is an appetite for political violence emanating from the state. How do you
That's right.
see this
Okay.
development, even though it's kind of anecdotal?
Okay, so no, I mean, 2 points. One, that since the 80s, certainly since a long decade of, you mentioned the insurgency and counterinsurgency in Punjab, but it was also the decade of riots. So when you had the plethora of, as it were, the kind of multiplication of armed constabularies, which were then seen to be part of the agents of riots that took place in UP, in Maharashtra, in Gujarat. It was a decade of riots and caste violence right from the late 70s on to up to the mid to late 80s. Post that, with the Ram Janmabhoomi, what you get, and therefore you get, as it were, my point being that the state machineries were always, particularly police, civic machineries were always complicit in riots in India. And, commissions after commissions have, borne witness to that. Then you have, as it were, the second change in this kind of relationship between violence and politics, where violence becomes a form of mobilization, as we saw with the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. Wherever the chariot went, there were riots, and that then translated into political power, electoral power for the BJP. Bloom Hansen, but also Jaffalo have shown that, in their work. But now you have something else, because now you have, as it were, state capture, and this is the thing. And there have been multiple sources of violence in India. But as I said, that the being against the state through the Gandhian vocabulary towards, say, even environmentalism, there's been a kind of very protean array of, non-statist, anti-statist. You don't have to be a secessionist to be anti-state. You can be an environmentalist to be against the state. And that kind of coheres a lot of the Indian political system. Now with Yogi and all of the rest, what you're getting is a desire, as I say, to close the gap between the political order, which lies beyond the state. Precisely, it has these violent capacities for mobilization. These people have deployed it. They know it all too well. Plus, and now to kind of seek an order out of it. And therefore, the state will, look like a more kind of authoritarian machinery. And as you say, more in line with what might appear as a more Western state of kind of monopolizing violence. But I think it's not taking that form, because this is not based on a contractual system. The Western state is a contractual system of give and take, whereas this is very authoritarian. You get in line or you are going to be in trouble. Slightly different.
Right. And I think there's a very interesting reason as to why that's also happening. And that, I think, is the important role that is played by the RSS, which obviously has come much closer to state power than it ever has in its history at this point of time, which is a kind of inflection point for the RSS, because the RSS has deliberately, whether it's from the time of KB Hedgewar, who wanted to keep it distinct from the Hindu Mahasabha, wanted to keep it beyond politics. He himself used to attend Congress sessions. Several RSS members were also members of the Congress right at the outset, trying to create this notion that this is about culture and not about politics. And this is well before Godse and so on. And I think the RSS has always kind of kept that this is above politics, whether it's convenience or whether it's principle, that's a different issue. But given the fact that the RSS is kind of sitting outside the formal state machinery, at least theoretically, how do you see that?
Well, I mean, So since you mentioned the Hedgewar moment, and the thing is, it's not that they were pro-Congress, that they, the founding figures of the RSS said.
Could you just say that again, because there was that ping. So
sorry. So I said, it's not that they were pro-Congress, but rather the founding figures such as Hedgewar.
No, just can you start the answer again? So we'll cut that part out.
Yeah.
So I'll ask the question. I'll cue you in again. No, because you just stopped me. So you start by saying that since you spoke about Hedgewar.
I'll just say, since you spoke about Hedgewar and the founding moment of the RSS, I mean, it's not that these members were going to the Congress. Yes, there was a fair amount of overlap between Mahasabha and Congress, but the RSS was a very strict body of allegiance and of loyalty. And this was I have called it a kind of formative secret society, which offered a second world to the manifest world, right? Precisely because figures like Hedgewar thought that the political realm was inadequate. It was not a waiting room, it was a preparatory room for the creation of a new political fraternity in India, which has come to its fruition today in its near 100th year in it was founded in 1925, and 2025 it's going to be its centenary. So it wasn't that it was above politics. It always thought that the given political realm was inadequate and that it needed to prepare the young man for a new kind of political fraternity to come about. So today, that's why I'm saying it's a party state in the sense that you have different organs of the same kind of political matrix, RSS, BJP, in power and with state capture, that it is hard to distinguish, just the way with CCP, it is hard to distinguish where the party begins, where the society ends, and where the state begins. And this is the kind of blurring we are getting in India, where so people talk about institutional capture. It's not simply institutional capture. It is the creation of a new kind of statecraft in India, precisely because figures like the RSS and all realize, much like the founding figures realized, that the domain beyond the law was politically potent in India. And that
but I'd like to push back a little bit on this. I certainly agree with you of the fact that the RSS thought that the political domain was inadequate, as in whether that realization was well held or because of purely pragmatic considerations is a different issue. But as far as the BJP is concerned, and this conflation of party and state, I think there is something to be said about the fact that there are a number of different viewpoints that sit within the BJP today. That sometimes is portrayed as monolithic. It's easy to think of it that way, and that's kind of the meter in which public commentary tends to view the BJP. And while there has been a certain degree of movement towards a kind of one India, one X kind of thinking, but there are different shades of opinion that seem to exist within the BJP on a range of issues. So if we were to take one issue which kind of surprised many people, and by the BJP I mean both the party itself as well as everyone whom we think of as sort of affiliated to the Sangh, if we take the issue of Section 377, which is the decriminalization of homosexuality. And at that point of time, it was very interesting because there was a sharp fissure down the middle in the BJP, with a set of members saying that this is against Indian culture, and a set of members saying that this is entire Indian culture has always had its Brihannalas, it has always had its Shikhandis, and this is something that we should accept. So do you think the BJP is as monolithic as it's been out to be, or is it just some intellectual laziness?
No, it's not. And I will take a bigger issue than sexuality, though sexuality is an important issue. I will take the issue of religion. So someone like Savarkar is an atheist. So he is not simply anti-Muslim, he's actually anti-Buddhism as well. So it's not simply a kind of Indic tradition. His whole argument is that India lacks a political gravity precisely because, Ashoka became its greatest emperor and became non-violent.
That's right. So I think that's an interesting aside that, in fact, if you read the first 30 pages of the Essentials of Hindutva, you'd think that the biggest enemy to India are the Buddhists. And
and for him it is the primary. For him, absolutely. It is the primary. It is a primary antagonism in India because it's, and in a way, he's also ventriloquizing, he's also speaking for the present, and Buddha stands and non-violence stands for Gandhi. It's very, very clear, Gandhi, and, but also to some degree Ambedkar, because Ambedkar is also, so the issue in India, so in the BJP world is precisely whether it is a politicalness of Hinduism, of Hinduness, which is what Savarkar is after. Savarkar is after a political Hinduness. He's not saying Hindutva to him is actually, as Shashi Tharoor and others have written, he's actually saying Hindu, it is not the realization of Hinduism. It has got nothing to do with religion. It's got everything to do with what a political Hindu might be. And whereas you have, as it were, the VHP, and you have other kinds of figures who see BJP as a realization of political power of Hinduism. Very different. And this is a kind of contest you are seeing. It is a contest also between the BJP and the RSS, because the RSS has a very different kind of idea of what India should look like. Having said all of that, there is a kind of complete coherence to the project in terms of a Hindu first identity for India, for which then legal other social institutions can be manipulated and be made ready, which has been the task of the BJP, of the RSS. But above all, I think it's a culture of political culture based on obedience and loyalty. So it's not quite like a political party, other political parties, where there is there may be obedience, but this is a kind of, it is a kind of,
we are on some slippery slope here.
yeah, but there is a kind of disciplined obedience to a leader. And that is the hierarchical notion of leadership, which has been inculcated in the RSS.
I don't know. I just get a sense that certainly that might be the case with the RSS, but I think the BJP is sometimes not given enough credit of being more diverse than it is. And I think that is a bit of intellectual laziness. But as you rightly pointed out, as in there is a kind of larger project, and I think that's a great segue to talk about the Constitution, because a large part of your book deals with Ambedkar. And as you say, and as I've also felt, as in Ambedkar's often and kind of very paradoxically now become the holy cow, right? As it's, you see that everyone's appropriating Ambedkar. From the left to the right, I think even the communists who really didn't have the time of day for him at that point of time. So now, as far as Ambedkar is concerned, Ambedkar, of course, has thought about violence and fraternity more than some of the other figures that you've talked about in your book, and sort of more deeply, in a more academic kind of way, with a certain sophistication that perhaps is lacking among some others. But as far as the primary point is concerned, as in it seems that for him, the Constitution was the testament to the kind of fraternity that he hoped that India would one day become. Now, this Constitution was supposed to become some kind of umbrella document, which is home for disparate faiths, classes, creeds, religions to interact as citizens. So we really didn't, in the Constitution, we took India as the way it was, didn't try to change it in any significant way, but instead hoped that now with Indian institutions, with self-rule, we are going to get to a better place with kind of a constitution that is similar to the Government of India Act 1935. So what is your view on how Ambedkar saw fraternity, and where do you see the constitutional project 75 years later?
Okay, I'll be very quick, but it will relate to the theme of violence. So I have not interpreted Ambedkar as the great rights thinker, the giver of rights to India, but someone who is really a much harder thinker than that. In the sense, he said, where does violence come from in India? He's saying, well, violence is what has organized caste. Caste is basically a violent institution. It is so violent that it doesn't even need to display its violence. His point is very similar to the other figures of the Indian age, which is that it is something in ourselves. It is immanent. It is not something that is out there, which we can manage or negotiate. His problem is post the Pune Pact that he cannot and has never depended on the kind of goodwill, if you will, of the upper caste to share power with the lower caste. And he's saying, now that's not going to happen. Gandhi may want internal reform and maybe the more durable way to kind of get out of caste. But the problem with caste is that these people are not going to share power. It is going to be. So the only way you can do it is that this is a kind of hidden civil war in India's society, is to actually pitch different castes in opposition to each other through reservation so that there can be competition between groups. So this is, in a way, a non-violent solution to the violence of caste. And this is actually borne out in the multi-party democracy of India, that barring the BJP, all the parties that came up are caste parties. Multiple party systems in India have been caste parties. And that is how, as it were, political contestation has taken place in a democracy in India. So I think the centerpiece of the Indian Constitution, over and above, is the caste question. And in a way, you could say, if you want to, I don't want to be too controversial, but in my view, a mistake was made in the founding document, because no political rights, I'm not talking separate electorates, were reserved for religious minorities. And which is therefore allowed for the trammeling. So, you kind of resurrected the caste question, which was required, which of course, meant that India could have a kind of agonism of castes. Different castes could kind of struggle for political power. But somehow Pakistan was seen to be the end point of political rights for Muslims, which actually was a catastrophic error for the Indian Republic, because most Muslims did not move. So Indian Muslims were actually, have paid the cost in a way for the Indian Constitution.
Yeah, and it allowed this kind of division to remain outside the system as in society rather than be
That's
channeled
right, and
in the
therefore
way
you
that
can
in
have
the
a
way
majoritarian politics. That
yeah,
is why you can
absolutely.
have a majoritarian.
That's what allows the fertile ground for a majoritarian politics. Absolutely. As in, so I think the hope was in the other direction that by not talking about it, as in it will go away. But I think what has happened, whether with religion, is that certainly it hasn't gone away. But even with caste, and I think you say that this is of course created this contestation as in within the realm of the constitution, and of course with Mandal coming in, as in that has kind of amplified that manifold, as in, because a lot of the caste-based parties are post-Mandal parties.
That's right.
In that sense. But you made a very important point, and that resonates with what has happened in the recent elections, right? Even if you were to take the example of UP, one of the key factual basis as to why the BJP has done so well again, as it is because of the split in the scheduled caste, both
That's
between
right.
the Jatovs and the non-Jatovs. And it's kind of mind-boggling, as in for a Bengali middle class Bengali who aware of caste growing up, but because of my privilege and background, perhaps not as aware of it as I should have. Just it's mind-boggling to see the kinds of distinctions and the kinds of identity politics that are necessary in order to win elections in India. And it's sort of the BJP is obviously, despite its larger project, as it is very much playing that game better than anybody else. Now, so how do you see this effort of creating this mutual antagonism within the political sphere through affirmative action? How do you see it is in having achieved its
No, I mean,
objectives?
I think in a way,
Or do you think just it's too early to judge because caste
no, I
is
don't say
whatever
that. I
centuries
think
old?
not at all. I think the rules of the game were set, and by Ambedkar in this manner, and for good reason. I'm not saying there were no good reasons, but I think you can take the contrasting example. There were many reasons why the Congress lost the Punjab election, but it is interesting that the sitting Dalit chief minister could not, as it were, articulate a Dalit identity, given the fact that more than a third of Punjab is Dalit, that the largest Dalit population by percentage in any state is in Punjab. But then there is this idea that the Sikhs don't have caste. So, there's also a squeamishness around that issue in a way that there is not that squeamishness in UP. So I think there is a question of incorporation going on, and the BJP is doing that. And there's a word that M.N. Srinivas, the great anthropologist or controversial anthropologist, used, Sanskritization, so that that actually the lower castes want to be incorporated into a kind of higher. I mean, it's a controversial thesis. It's not something I fully subscribe to, but there is that process going on with the Aam Aadmi Party as well as with the BJP, where a kind of caste-based politics is being circumvented around other more populist questions, whether it is whether it's welfare delivery, whether it is upward mobility, whether it is public goods. So those kinds of things are also coming into play. Having said that, there is also the problem is not that the BJP got these votes. The problem is that the BSP gave up on its political role, and that vacuum is not going to just remain. It will be.
Right. It will be filled, and I think that's a sort of larger conversation on UP, and we can have another conversation on it. But it reminded me of something that the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, said about race, and it was in relation to affirmative action programs, and he said this to considerable criticism from both his colleagues Sonia Sotomayor on the bench as well as several commentators. He says the way to not discriminate on the basis of race is by not discriminating on the basis of race. Okay, so that's what he was trying to say, that so you just don't talk about race. So it's basically.
I don't think. I mean, so I'm not of that.
So basically, if you were to hold that kind of view, which is what seems to have happened for religion in some sense, and not for caste in India, is that we said, okay, with the Pakistan question, the Muslim question has gone, and so we don't need to talk about it anymore. Do you think that had we done the same with the caste question, where would we have been today?
No, I think there was no way out. This question had to be addressed, and I think this is both Ambedkar's triumph his triumph is not actually the constitution per se, and its forward-looking social doctrine, but the triumph is that the recognition of the Dalit founds the idea of national citizenship. The national citizen, because his argument is what is common to India. What is common to India from every village to across villages is the caste question and the Dalit question. So it's not about the OBCs and the myriad distinctions. He's actually saying the untouchable, the Dalit, is what unifies India, because it is a common thread across states, across linguistic barriers, and the like. So I think was important, was required, and I don't think that job is done. I mean, the thing about India's inequality is that it's nowhere near that. Fine and said you had 70 years of reservation, but as a result, it is also not, I'm now not saying anything very new, but it is also not a coincidence that the BJP rises to electoral power after Mandal. So it, in a way, it is also a beneficiary, a perverse beneficiary, because it is a consolidation.
Well, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
No, but it's more than that. It incites the occasion for upper caste consolidation.
Consolidation, absolutely. And I think that upper caste consolidation was done so successfully that then it allowed for further consolidation of different kinds, which is what the BJP is playing. And certainly,
and therefore, the OBC became the floater voter of India. But exactly. Even that is kind of changing, as you know, because a lot of the OBC parties are part of the NDA alliance, or the OBCs are also beginning to vote, barring in UP and a couple of other places, are also voting for the BJP, because the BJP is trying to create a new political settlement of India. And it is an aggressive political settlement of India, which which is taking all sorts of forms, from the kind of reshaping perhaps of the constitution to federalism, but above all the new compact, as I said, between the citizen and the state.
And I think that's a great moment to leave it. I think this new political settlement is beautifully and succinctly captures where we are, because there is a feeling that exists currently that the BJP is firmly in charge without there being anything effective, either in terms of ideas or in terms of political will that exists. And I think what the shape this new political settlement takes is very interesting. We could go in many directions with this, some more hopeful and some less so. But I think to understand the directions it would take, we need to look at our history. And I think Shruti's book does a wonderful job of looking at India's history from 1857 to 1947, a very instructive period to what is happening at this time. So thank you very much, Shruti, for this conversation and also writing this wonderful book. I once again encourage everyone to pick up this book. It will very much be worth your time. Thanks, Shruti.
Time for CLATTR, our legal quiz that's a bit tougher than CLAT. Clearly, last week's question was a googly for several of you. Several answers came in, but no right ones. That what is the index where the Ukrainian parliament scored 0.11 early on and then increased significantly in the lead up to the war? What is the name of the index where the Ukrainian parliament scored 0.11? The answer is the Rice Index, which looks at the level of consensus or cohesion in a multi-member parliamentary body. I think everyone got a bit bamboozled by that one. So here's hoping that this times will be easier. Turning to this week's quiz, connect a sculpture by William Bennis in Trafalgar Square with an island in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. A hint, think the Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Indian Independence of 1857, which is covered in Shruti's excellent book. Do write in with your answers to justify at vidhilegalpolicy.in. All right answers stand a chance to win an exciting prize. And since we spoke about violence, and violence in India is synonymous with many people, but noble violence in India is synonymous with Bhagat Singh. So here is one of my favorites, Sarfaroshi Ki Tamanna. Enjoy the song, Arghya.
सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में है, सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में है, देखना है जोर कितना बाजुए कातिल में है, सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में है.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, follow us on Twitter at Vidhi_India for regular updates. We are on SoundCloud and Spotify as Vidhi Center for Legal Policies podcast. You can also listen to us on Google Podcasts or iTunes. Email us at justify@vidhilegalpolicy.in to share your comments and feedback on this episode.